So this session, we are going to be looking at Karl Marx conflict theory, but we are mainly going to focus on two of his concepts. Marx, of course, introduced to us quite a number of interesting concepts that he was using as an analytical lens to understand the modern industrialized and capitalist society, and to explain the human condition under capitalism. So alienation and class struggle are key concepts in Marx's ideas. But before we go into detail about these key concepts, I think we first need to look at a little bit of Marx's biography, a little bit of Marx's history and upbringing. As I've always highlighted, that people do not theorize in a social vacuum. People theorize from specific positions, socio-economic, political, and even religious circumstances and events play an important role in the way in which people theorize. And as C. Wright Mills, he reminded us as sociologists, what we need to do is to theorize from a sociological imagination that is taking into consideration the bigger macro structures that are prevailing during that particular time, and how they shape the way in which we theorize. The biography of those that are theorizing is particularly important, as well as the history, which plays an important role in shaping circumstances. So in much of what people talk about Marx's work, the emphasis has largely been on what people refer to as the mature Marx or the older Marx, and very few go back to the younger Marx, who was very much a philosopher, was very much a humanist, and a Hegelian in a way. So we want to look at younger Marx and how younger Marx transitioned to the older Marx and the mature Marx in terms of the intellectual thinking. So Marx was born in modern day Germany. Of course, back then it was regarded as Prussia, in 1818. And he came from a relatively well-to-do, educated, middle-class environment and family. So his early life was pretty much comfortable, because his father was a prominent lawyer who was very much influenced by the Enlightenment thinking and the Enlightenment ideas around science, rationalism, and liberalism. So Marx, he actually had a very early exposure to ideas of Enlightenment thinking. That is, ideas around reason, ideas around progress, as well as individual rights, liberty, and fraternity, as well as the secularization or secular ideas of society. So it's important to emphasize that Marx did not really begin as a revolutionary in terms of his writing, but he was the product of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment liberalism. So in his early life, Marx was a philosopher, he was an economist, and a theorist whose work focused on how capitalism shaped human life, especially through processes of exploitation, the inequalities that it engendered, as well as the conflict that emanated from the unequal access to the means of production and the exploitative nature of the capitalist system. So Marx's early work he focused on his concept of alienation, and he developed this concept of alienation in his economic and philosophical manuscripts. That's what the younger Marx is well known for, developing the concept of alienation from the economic and philosophical manuscripts that he was looking at. And he developed this concept of alienation around the 1840s in his work on economic and philosophical manuscripts, which was, of course, published in 1844. So these manuscripts were written during Marx's early intellectual development, and he was still living in France, in Paris, to be specific, during that particular time. So his concept of alienation is rooted in the structure of capitalist production, the way in which the capitalist system was arranged and organized. And for Marx, alienation occurs when workers lose control over their labor and the products that they create, leading to some form of estrangement. So according to Marx, alienation refers to the condition in which human beings become estranged from their own humanity under the capitalist system. And this is what then leads to estrangement, where workers are sort of separated from the products of their labor power. So before we maybe go into much detail about alienation, it's also important for us to highlight some of Marx's influence, the thinkers who influenced Marx's thinking and Marx's ideas. And I think Friedrich Hegel is one of the key influence to Marx's ideas and Marx's theorizing. So Hegel initially used the idea of alienation to describe how consciousness becomes separated from itself in historical development before reconciling with itself. So this concept that Marx adopted of alienation is something that he borrowed from Hegel, who initially used that concept of alienation. Then he was also influenced by people like Feuerbach and Ludwig Feuerbach, who had argued that religion alienates humans or human beings by projecting their own powers onto a God. So you see here Hegel and Feuerbach using the concept of alienation, of course differently. Hegel more philosophical, and Feuerbach as a critique of religion. And then people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo were also influential to Marx thinking, especially their analysis of labor and value, which provided, the economic framework that Marx used in his own work, and later critiqued some of their ideas on labor and value. So Marx then adopted the concept of alienation from Hegel and Feuerbach, but transformed it from being a philosophical idea into a socio-economic critique of the capitalist system. So instead of focusing on religion, like what Feuerbach did, or on consciousness alone, Marx argued that alienation arises from the material organization of the capitalist system of production. So you can see that he's moving it from being a philosophical concept to a materialist concept. And later on, I think we'll talk about his idea of historical materialism and also some of the influence around historical materialism. So Marx's analysis of alienation refers to the condition in which human beings become separated from, aspects of their humanity from the fruits of their labor due to the capitalist system and the capitalist labor relations. So under capitalism, according to Marx, workers sell their labor power for them to survive. And this kind of arrangement creates some structural forms of estrangement because workers no longer have control over, for instance, what they produce. Is the capitalists who determine what is produced, how much is produced, when is it produced. So the workers no longer have control over what they produce. They no longer have control over how they produce. And they also no longer have control on even why they produce or how much they should produce. So Marx's concept of alienation is typically an analysis of the capitalist system. So workers become disconnected from what they produce, how they produce, who they are as workers, and also how they relate to other people, including fellow workers. And Marx developed this idea most clearly, like I highlighted in his early work under the economic and philosophical manuscripts. So Marx then identified 4 interrelated forms of alienation, and he was basically arguing that alienation is caused by a number of things, but of course, most importantly, the capitalist mode of production, including private ownership of the means of production, where things become privately owned by the bourgeoisie. Then the introduction of wage labor, where you have workers that are sort of proletarianized, meaning to say that they have nothing to sell for them to survive except their labor. Then the division of labor and specialization, which cuts down the production process into very small and less meaningful components. So for instance, in the manufacturing of vehicles, you've got people that are just waiting to put the tires, others that are waiting to put the injectors, others waiting to put the brakes. So workers become alienated from the production process because they no longer identify with the final product, because what they are contributing into the production process is very, very little. Maybe if you're manufacturing clothes, there are some people that are just putting the collar, other people putting the pocket, other people putting the zip or the buttons. So a worker contributes very little to the production process, and as a result, that sort of disconnects them from the final output. So they are also alienated because of the emphasis on profit maximization instead of human need, where production is geared towards profit maximization. So under capitalism, you see that workers do not own what they produce, but what they produce is owned by those that own the means of production, those that control the factories, the land, and other means of production, and they sell their labor for them to survive. And without selling their labor, these workers would struggle to survive, and therefore work becomes a means to live and not really a fulfilling kind of activity. So Marx identified 4 interrelated forms of alienation. One, he argued that alienation occurs in a scenario where workers produce goods, but the products that they produce belong to the capitalist and not the worker. So that is alienation from the product of the labor. Workers are alienated from the product in as much as it's something that they produce. They are alienated from it because they are paid so little that they cannot afford. So you are producing, let's say, a Rolls Royce, a Lamborghini, a Ferrari, but you're paid so little that you cannot actually afford that product that you are producing. So it becomes a paradox that workers create the world of commodities, but they are excluded from the benefits of those commodities that they produce. So the implications of this is that the product, for instance, confronts the worker as an external power, as something that is owned and sold by others. Yet, paradoxically, is produced by that very same worker who is alienated from that product. The workers, for instance, the more the workers produce, the more powerful the capital becomes relative to them. So they are producing and enabling one to accumulate wealth, but they become progressively exploited. They become progressively poor, even though they are producing value through the products that they are manufacturing. So workers create wealth, but do not control or benefit proportionally from that particular wealth that they produce. So this is a typical of a factory worker who assembles vehicles but cannot afford to buy those vehicles that they produce. This is a worker who is working in mining, but they cannot afford to buy the jewelry that comes from maybe the gold or the diamonds that they actually produce. So the product becomes something that is foreign, but even sometimes also hostile to the very same worker who produces that particular product. Then the second kind of alienation that Marx identified is alienation from the process of work. Workers in this case have very little control over how they work and how work is organized. And he argued that the workers become an appendage of the machine. They become a cog in a machine, just like any other cogs that are part of the machine. So workers do not have control over how they are working and how work arrangements are done. So work becomes, for instance, very repetitive, very strictly controlled, and also dictated either by the employers or the machines themselves. So in this case, you see that there's a lot of repetition, which then stifles human creativity. So human creativity in this case is sort of removed from the production process. Why? Because the workers no longer have control over how work is organized. So the implications of this is that the worker become a cog in a machine or an appendage of that machine. And workers start to engage in work that is more mechanical, that is more surveilled, and also repetitive. You can think of workers in the automotive industry, where, for instance, workers are producing in mass production, like during the time of Fordism, where they're producing, but you're producing something that you yourself cannot afford because of how little your salary is. So labor becomes something that the worker has to endure rather than something through which they realize themselves as workers or identify with the product or with the work process. The third kind of alienation that Marx identified is alienation from what he referred to as the species being, or alienation from human nature. So this is, the philosophical aspect of his analysis of the capitalist system and the alienation that it generates. So Marx believed that humans or human beings are unique because they are creative, they are conscious producers who are able to shape the world intentionally and he called this a human essence or species being. So under capitalism, work is reduced to mere survival. It's survivalist. And human creative potential is also suppressed because the a process of production is controlled by the capitalists who are driven by, of course, profit interest and maximization. And labor no longer expresses human individuality or purpose. Therefore, you see that workers become alienated from their own human nature. And this is what Marx referred to as alienation from species being. That, the worker becomes alienated from human nature because human nature allows people to be creative, it allows people to be social beings, it allows people to be productive beings. But under capitalism, work becomes driven by survival and not necessarily self-fulfillment. And people cannot express their full humanity because of how they are working. So imagine you are in a conveyor belt. There's specialization, there's division of labor. You're producing drinks. There are some people that are putting the empty bottles. There are some people that are putting the liquid. There are some people that are putting the lid. And then there are some people that are taking the bottles that are filled and sealed. They put them in a crate. And then there are some other people that are taking them to the storeroom. So the moment you begin to be a social being, to engage with your colleagues, then there are 3 or 4 bottles that might actually pass without a lid, or that would pass without the liquid. And under scientific management, under Taylor's scientific management, they will be able to pick where this problem occurred, and then the workers would be in very serious trouble. So workers become estranged from each other. So even those that are talented, in most cases, you see that they start to engage in low wage for them to survive in a scenario or under circumstances where they hardly have any control over what they produce and how they produce. Then the 4th type of alienation that Marx identified is alienation from other beings, alienation from the people. So under capitalist structures, you see that the capitalist system structures relations through competition as well as a market exchange. And this is typical of what happens where the competition that is created sort of stifles a cooperation amongst the workers. And workers compete for jobs. The relationships that are generated becomes more transactional rather than cooperative. And the implications of these is that workers start to compete for jobs. And instead of relating as beings, the relationships that are forged become very transactional, and this tends to weaken forms of social solidarity amongst the workers themselves. As such, people become alienated from other workers and also from the employers and sometimes from the broader society because of how the capitalist system is structured. And therefore, you see that human relations become increasingly shaped by market relations, or they easily resemble the market relations. And this is an important part of Marx's analysis of alienation, in the sense that the capitalist system significantly affects the ways in which workers express themselves under capitalist systems of production. So the older Marx did not necessarily abandon the concept of alienation, but of course he later reframed this concept within the broader economic analysis under several other works that he did. For instance, the German ideology, as well as Das Kapital. some of the work that he later on developed as he transitioned from being a philosophical Marx to a Marx who was more interested in political economy. So here the concept of alienation in Marx's later work became linked to things such as commodity fetishism, right, where social relations appear as relations between commodities. It also appeared through his analysis of exploitation, where workers produce surplus value, but that surplus value is appropriated by the capitalists rather than those that produce that particular value. So as such, you see that alienation becomes more of a structural feature of the capitalist system of production, and not just a philosophical or a psychological feeling. And this is what and how Marx developed his concept. So we can apply this concept even in the modern day society in many ways. Although Marx wrote this work in the 19th century, many scholars argue that alienation remains a relevant analytical concept to understand the way in which work is organized even in the modern and contemporary societies. So, for instance, if you look at corporates as well as bureaucratic organizations, you would see that work is corporatized, is bureaucratic in nature, and as a result, you see that most of the contemporary forms of work still involve a very rigid kind of hierarchies, where there is very limited worker autonomy, and where work is also very much repetitive, and workers are often experience, for instance, low control over working conditions, which reflects Marx's second form of alienation. When you look at gig work, for instance, gig work operates through what are referred to as platforms, which illustrate new forms of alienation, where algorithms determine work allocation, right? The work is allocated through the platform or the algorithms. Workers do not control the pricing under gig work or under platform work, and workers sometimes can also be isolated from other workers. So this creates what some scholars refer to as algorithmic management. And algorithmic management might be imagined as an extension of Marx's alienation from the labor process, where the worker does not have control over the labor process. So in essence, Marx argued that when people lose control over the conditions and the meaning of their labor, they become estranged from their work, from themselves, from their co-workers, but sometimes also even from the broader society. And Marx's concept of alienation helps us to understand how capitalist production separates workers from their labor, from their products, from their human potential, and from one another. So, like I said, that although this was developed in the 19th century, this framework continues to illuminate modern day economic structures, especially in digital economies, as well as globalized labor systems that we are seeing emerging with platform work, with gig work, and many contemporary debates around automation, for instance, around even AI and how AI is shaping the labor process, gig work, and also corporate power can be understood as extensions of Marx's concept of alienation. So that is something that's interesting about Marx's work on alienation. So all these things that we have highlighted lead us to Marx's second concept, that is his concept of the class struggle. And Marx was arguing that in each and every epoch, in each and every period in human history, there are always two classes which are antagonistic. So under feudalism, for instance, or the feudal mode of production, we have the serfs, who are the workers. You think of your farm workers. Then you have the landlords, those that own and control the farms. And Marx was saying that these classes, they are always competing. They've got competing interests. And as a result, because of their different classes and their different class interests, they are always antagonistic. They are always fighting. The other one is fighting for better working conditions. The other one is fighting to maximize their profits. So even when you move from feudalism to capitalism, you see the transition. The serfs become the proletariats, and then the landlords in under capitalism become what you refer to as the bourgeoisie. Those that are the capitalists, the industrialists, they own the businesses, the factories, the land, and other means of production. So a class struggle, according to Marx, refers to the conflict between different social classes over their economic interests. So this is part of what Marx developed in his Communist Manifesto, where he was looking at history of society and argues that what drives history in society is the class struggle, the competition over resources. So for Marx, the society is divided into classes which are based on their relationship to the means of production. So under capitalism, you have like I said, the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie are the ones that own the factories, they own the businesses, they own the land, they own the capital. And then you have the proletariat. And the proletariat is only have their labor to sell for them to survive. So they are subjected to all forms of exploitation and alienation that we talked about earlier on. So what causes this class struggle is that it arises because of structural conflicting interests between these two classes. And not, of course, necessarily personal disagreements, but the way in which the work is organized and the alienated nature of how the work is organized. So workers produce more values, but they are paid very, very little. And this is tied to Marx's idea of surplus value, that the capitalist system is driven by the interest for surplus value, for profits. So a worker works and produces maybe $1,000 on a daily basis, but maybe they are paid $20 on a daily basis, meaning to say that the rest goes to the profit of those that own the means of production. And they try to ensure that they minimize the benefits of the employees. So these employees do not have any pensions. Sometimes they lack even protective clothing. They don't have any medical insurance. Why? Because this would eat into the cake, into the profits of the capitalists. So they work very long hours. So all these ways in which work is organized is what then contributes to the class struggle. You can think of mining workers, for instance, who toil the whole day, the whole month underground, sometimes facing serious risks, respiratory risks, and some people even getting trapped underground. You think of the oil workers, for instance, in oil-rich countries. You think of the Middle East, and where people spend the whole day in very precarious and also sometimes very dangerous spaces, but they are paid very little. So the inequality that we see in how wealth accumulates is part of what lead to this class struggle. And you see that they've got competing interests. And this competing interest is what drives the struggle between the proletariats and the bourgeoisie. So the workers are demanding higher wages, they are demanding better living conditions and better working conditions, while the capitalists, in contrast, want very low costs, very low production costs. They want to pay very low wages so that they could maximize on their profits, and they don't want to invest in the welfare of the workers. And as a result, this estrangement and this exploitation and the inequality, according to Marx, is what drives this class struggle. Even the issues of controlling the production process is also part of what drives this class struggle over who controls the land, who controls the factories and the resources. So you would see that all these are controlled by a very minority group of people, sometimes referred to as the oligarchs, and they are the ones that determines how, when, and how much is produced, sometimes at the expense of the worker himself. So you will see different forms of class struggles emerging. For instance, economic class struggles where workers are striking for better wages. You can think of the Marikana example, where workers are striking and demanding better wages. It could also be political, where maybe people are agitating for reforms over the laws and the policies that they might see as exploitative. But it could also be ideological, right? You think of your fees must fall, for instance, where students were demanding a decolonized kind of education because of how they see the ideological influence of the education system, the mass media, and how it shapes our everyday life and beliefs. So all these are very interesting concepts that Marx introduced to explain the capitalist system and how the capitalist system operates. And we see, for instance, a shift in Marx's ideas from a predominant focus on philosophical humanism, Hegelian ideas, to political economy. And in this case, the focus on alienation, human nature, and philosophy in younger Marx, influenced, of course, by Hegel, and how his argument was that the capitalist system dehumanizes the worker. But we see a shift in focus from a very philosophical, a very humanist younger Marx to a mature Marx who was more interested in economics, a class struggle, as well as the capitalist structure, especially in some of his work in Das Kapital, where he emphasized that capitalism is a system that is epitomized by massive exploitation, and this massive exploitation is what is going to lead to a class struggle and a revolution, which would eventually lead to its collapse as the workers of the world unite and fight to overthrow an exploitative system. So you see that there are sort of continuations or continuities in Marx's explanations of alienation as a lived experience, and of course his later work on the class struggle, which explains the structural conflict that is embedded in the capitalist system or the capitalist mode of production, or as a sort of a critique of the capitalist system. So we can also connect alienation and class struggle in Marx's work by looking at how alienation foregrounds how capitalism feels, what workers feel working under a capitalist system, and then the feeling of alienation and the class struggle, looking at how capitalism functions, the way in which it is organized and how it functions. So alienation then can lead to maybe worker disaffection and sometimes collective awareness, what Marx referred to as class consciousness. When the people gain class consciousness, then they might engage in a revolution that would overthrow an exploitative system and lead to resistance. So with these two concepts, what Marx is basically trying to tell us is that capitalism changes how we experience our everyday life. It can make us feel disconnected and sometimes even powerless, even from the things that we produce, things that are coming from our own labor power. And that is the epitome of his concept of alienation. And second, Marx is also telling us that, the capitalist system creates deep conflicts between different classes or groups in the society, especially the workers, who we refer to as the proletariats, and those who own the means of production, who are the bourgeoisie. And this is what lead to the class struggle that Marx was talking about, as people contest their exploitation, the inequality, and the alienation that is generated by the way in which work is organized. So, as a way of concluding, you would see that there is a key intellectual shift in Marx's work and ideas. Like I was saying, younger Marx was more interested in human essence. He was more interested in alienation and philosophical conceptualizations of all these ideas and how these ideas shape reality. But the later Marx, or the mature Marx, he then moved to a more interest on material conditions under the capitalist system and the capitalist mode of production. He was more interested in the exploitative nature of the capitalist system, and he began to develop very strong interest in political economy and how material reality shapes ideas rather than how ideas shape reality. So this is what Marx was trying to highlight with these two key concepts of alienation and class struggle, which were deployed to analyze and explain the capitalist system. So in our next section, we are going to move to look at Weber and Weber's work, and maybe pick two concepts and then use those concepts in the same way that we have used Marx and his concept to explain a very modernized and industrialized capitalist society. So if you have any questions, you can put your questions in the comments. If you like the session, you can also either subscribe or share. Thank you.